Title: She Ruined My Wedding. I Ruined Her Reputation. Story: The ivory lace of my wedding dress was supposed to be the symbol of the best day of my life. But before the first vow could be spoken, it became a shroud for my entire reality. I thought I was the one pulling the strings of my own sabotage, but I soon realized I was just a pawn in a game where my own family was writing the script. And now, I have to burn the whole story down to survive. The ivory lace of my gown was supposed to be the symbol of the best day of my life. Instead, it became a burial shroud for my dignity. I stood at the altar, the scent of white lilies choking me, listening to the heavy silence of the church. My groom, Julian, stood beside me, his jaw clenched, his eyes darting toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the chapel. My guests, 200 people I had hand-selected to witness my transformation from a girl to a wife, were murmuring, their voices like dry leaves skittering across pavement. Then, the doors groaned open. In walked Elena. She wasn't wearing white. She was wearing a silk dress the color of a fresh bruise, a shade of deep, taunting plum that practically screamed for attention. She walked down the aisle with a slow, agonizing grace, a leather-bound notebook clutched in her manicured hands. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at the crowd. Her eyes were locked onto Julian like a heat-seeking missile. I felt the air leave the room, replaced by a vacuum of pure, suffocating dread. She reached the front, turned to the congregation, and cleared her throat, a sound that echoed like a gunshot in the vaulted ceiling. "I have something to read," she announced, her voice honey-dipped and deadly. A little history lesson for the benefit of the bride. I turned to Julian, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Stop her," I whispered, my voice trembling. He didn't look at me. He just stared at his shoes, his face drained of every drop of blood. Elena opened the book, and as she began to read the first entry, I realized that my wedding wasn't just ending. It was being shredded, line by line, into history. The ink on the pages was old, faded, and damning. As she read, the private messages, the dates, and the photos she held up for the crowd to see weren't just about Julian. They were about me. They detailed every insecurity I had ever confessed to her over the last 10 years of our so-called best friendship. She exposed the secrets I thought were buried in the deepest vaults of our history. She told everyone about the time I had lied to my parents, the petty thefts of my youth, and the moments I had been vulnerable enough to call her sobbing in the dark. I felt the eyes of my mother, my boss, and my future in-laws burning into my back. I was a fraud, and she was the architect of my total exposure. When she finally stopped, the silence was so profound I could hear the flickering of the candles. She stepped closer to me, leaning in until her breath, smelling faintly of peppermint and malice, hit my ear. "You always told me you wanted a wedding people would never forget, Sarah," she whispered. Mission accomplished. She turned to leave, her head held high, expecting me to collapse. She expected me to cry, to beg, or to faint. But as I watched her silhouette retreat, something inside me shifted. The humiliation was like a physical weight, crushing my lungs, but beneath it, a cold, sharp clarity began to sharpen. If she wanted a show, I would give her one. I took a deep breath, adjusted my veil, and walked over to the microphone she had just abandoned. "Wait," I said. My voice was steady, unnervingly so. The congregation froze. Elena paused at the threshold of the doors, her hand on the brass handle, a smirk already forming on her lips as she prepared to witness my total breakdown. "Since we're sharing history, Elena," I called out, my voice ringing clear through the speakers, "why don't we tell them about the trust fund you claim to have inherited? Or perhaps the marketing firm you claim to own? The one that is, funnily enough, registered to an empty P.O. box in Delaware." The smirk on her face faltered. I reached into the bodice of my gown, where I had tucked my phone just in case, and tapped a button on my screen. Suddenly, the church's sound system, which I had spent months perfecting for our first dance, began to play an audio file. It wasn't music. It was a recording of a hushed conversation, clear as crystal, featuring Elena's own voice admitting to the fraud she had committed against the very people sitting in these pews. She had been running a Ponzi scheme, siphoning money from our social circle, promising high returns while she funded her own lavish lifestyle. The room erupted. Investors, friends, and creditors stood up, their faces turning from curiosity to rage. Elena dropped the notebook, her hands shaking as she looked back at the crowd. She wasn't the victor anymore. She was the prey. I walked toward her, my long train trailing behind me like a judge's robe. "Did you really think I didn't know?" I asked her, my voice low. "Did you really think I'd marry a man who didn't tell me everything you'd been doing behind my back for the last 6 months?" Julian backed away from me, his face a mask of pure terror as he realized he was just as implicated in the mess as Elena was. But I wasn't done. I had spent months gathering evidence, anticipating this day, though I hadn't expected it to happen at the altar. I had been planning my exit strategy from this life for a long time, but I had decided to take the entire house of cards down with me. "Check your phones," I commanded the room, my voice booming over the chaos. I sent a packet to everyone on the guest list. Bank records, emails, the works. It's all there. The sound of hundreds of notifications pinging at once was the most beautiful symphony I had ever heard. People began scrolling, their faces pale, their eyes wide as they read the damning proof of Elena's and Julian's treachery. Elena lunged for me, her nails bared, but she was intercepted by her own creditors, a wall of angry men and women who had finally realized they had been played. She screamed, a raw, animal sound of defeat, as she was dragged away from the altar by the very people who had once toasted her as a socialite. I stood in the middle of the aisle, alone in my white dress, watching the destruction I had unleashed. I had ruined her reputation, yes. I had dismantled her world in a matter of seconds. But as I looked up, I saw the back door open again, and someone I hadn't invited, someone who definitely wasn't supposed to be here, stepped inside. The man stood in the shadows of the narthex, wearing a dark suit that made him look like a phantom in the harsh sunlight pouring through the stained glass. He didn't look at the chaos. He didn't care about the Ponzi scheme or the ruined wedding. He kept his eyes strictly on me. My pulse spiked. I recognized the mark on his lapel, a tiny gold pin in the shape of a serpent. He was the reason I had been forced to accelerate my plan. He was the reason I had been planning to leave this town the moment the I do's were finished. He stepped into the light, his expression unreadable, and he held up a small, familiar velvet box. "You did a wonderful job, Sarah," he said, his voice smooth and cold as ice. "But you left a very important piece of evidence behind in the vault. And my employers are not the type to settle for social media exposure." He walked down the aisle, completely unfazed by the screaming guests or the police sirens beginning to wail in the distance. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a photo of me, in a place I had sworn I had never been, holding something I should never have had. My heart stopped. He wasn't here to support me. He was here to collect a debt. "The show is over," he whispered, standing inches from my face. "Now, we play by my rules." The church was a riot of noise. The hysterical sobbing of the cheated investors, the frantic shouting of the caterers, and the distant rising wail of sirens. But here, in the center of the aisle, the world had collapsed into a pinprick of silence. The man, whose face possessed the sterile, terrifying smoothness of a mannequin, tilted his head. He didn't seem to notice that the sanctuary was falling apart. He only cared about the leverage he held. "You thought you were playing a game of chess, Sarah," he said, his voice barely audible over the roar of the crowd. "But you were merely a piece on the board. You thought you were burning Elena down to save yourself, but you've only cleared the path for the people who really own this town." I looked at the photo in his hand. It was me, taken 6 months ago in the back room of a secure warehouse in Geneva, holding a flash drive that contained the offshore account details of 3 major international syndicates. I had thought that theft was my ticket to freedom, my insurance policy against a life of being a trophy wife to a man like Julian. I had been so proud of my cleverness. I had been so arrogant. "Give it to me," I hissed, my hand trembling as I reached for the photograph. He pulled it back, his eyes dancing with a cruel, cold amusement. "Give it to you? You're in no position to bargain. You've just broadcasted the private failures of some very dangerous people in this room. You think the authorities are coming to save you? Look closer at the front row, Sarah." I looked. Julian was no longer cowering. He had stopped shaking. He stood up, straightened his tuxedo, and locked eyes with me. There was no fear in his gaze, only a hollow reptilian indifference. He wasn't a victim of Elena's schemes. He was the one who had choreographed them. And beside him, my own father, who I had assumed was horrified by the scandal, was currently whispering into his phone, his expression calm, predatory, and entirely unbothered by the fact that his daughter had just publicly nuked her own life. "The wedding wasn't the point," the man in the suit murmured. "The point was to see how far you would go to protect your secrets. You're more resourceful than we anticipated. You're a liability. The sirens weren't police. They were private security, and they weren't here to arrest Elena. They were here to secure the scene." I felt a cold chill run down my spine as I realized the church doors were being locked from the outside. The guests were being herded toward the exits, not by law enforcement, but by men in matching gray suits. Men who moved with the coordinated precision of a tactical unit. I took a step back, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. "What do you want?" The man smiled, revealing teeth that looked like perfectly honed porcelain. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a burner phone, sliding it across the altar toward me. It sat there, glowing with a single blinking red light. "You ruined Elena's reputation to distract the world from your own transgressions," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Now you have a choice. You can walk out of these doors and accept the life that has been prepared for you, a life of silence and servitude. Or you can answer that phone. But be warned, Sarah. The moment you press accept, you are no longer the bride. You are the bait." Behind him, the stained glass window shattered inward. Shards of colored light sprayed across the pews like blood. A figure dropped from the rafters, clad in black, landing with the lethal grace of a predator. The man in the suit didn't even flinch. He just watched me, waiting for my hand to move toward the phone. "You have 5 seconds, he whispered, "before the people who really own you decide that you've outlived your usefulness. Are you ready to stop playing? Or would you like to see how a real reputation is destroyed?" I looked at the phone, then at the man in black who was slowly rising from his crouch, his eyes fixed on the man with the serpent pin. The choice wasn't between freedom and prison. It was between being a pawn and becoming the weapon. My fingers brushed the cold plastic of the device. Suddenly, the lights in the church died, plunging us into absolute, crushing darkness. In the silence, I heard the distinctive, mechanical click of a safety being disengaged. I didn't know who the new arrival was, or if they were coming for me, for the man in the suit, or for the secrets tucked into the pockets of everyone in this room. "Sarah," a voice whispered in the dark. Not the man's voice, but a voice I knew better than my own. A voice I hadn't heard in years. It was my sister's voice. The sister who had been declared dead in a boating accident a decade ago. "Run," she breathed, right against my ear. I bolted. I turned toward the side exit, my veil tearing off as I scrambled over the pews, my heart drumming a frantic rhythm in my ears. I reached the heavy oak door and slammed my shoulder into it, expecting it to be locked, but it swung open into the night air. I didn't look back. I sprinted into the alleyway, the cold rain hitting my skin, until a black sedan screeched to a halt in front of me,
the passenger door swinging open. I looked into the car, expecting to see a savior. Instead, I saw my own reflection staring back at me from the rearview mirror, and a note resting on the passenger seat, written in my own perfect, flowing handwriting, dated for tomorrow. I stared at the note, my breath hitching in my throat. The paper was crisp, expensive, and carried the faint, familiar scent of the perfume I wore every day. The handwriting was unmistakably mine. The same loops on the yes, the same sharp cross on the tis. But I hadn't written this. I hadn't even been in this room until 10 minutes ago. Don't look for the truth, Sarah. Look for the mirror. Everything you've done was scripted. Welcome to the third act. I didn't get into the car. I couldn't. I backed away, my wet gown clinging to my legs like a shroud, feeling the cold rain mix with the sweat cooling on my skin. If I got into that vehicle, I was admitting that I was a character in someone else's play. If I didn't, I was a loose end, and loose ends are always cut. A sudden, bright beam of light cut through the alley, blinding me. It was the headlights of a second car, pulling up behind the first, boxing me into the narrow, brick-walled space. The engine of the first car revved, a low, predatory growl, and the passenger door clicked shut with a finality that made my stomach turn. I was trapped. The script is a fickle thing, isn't it? The voice didn't come from the cars. It came from the shadows of the fire escape above me. I looked up to see a woman draped in a trench coat, her face obscured by the brim of a wide hat. She looked exactly like me. My height, my build, even the same slight scar on her chin from a childhood fall. She wasn't my sister. She was a mirror. "Who are you?" I screamed, my voice cracking under the weight of the night. "I'm the one who paid for the wedding," she replied, stepping off the edge of the fire escape and landing on the wet pavement with an unnerving, feline silence. She didn't hit the ground hard. She landed like she had wings. "I'm the one who leaked the files to you in the first place, Sarah. I'm the one who fed you the secrets you thought you uncovered on your own. You didn't ruin their reputation, dear. You just finished the purge I couldn't do myself." I felt the ground tremble, not from an earthquake, but from the synchronized tread of a dozen pairs of boots marching into the alley from both ends. They were closing the perimeter. "Why?" I demanded, backing until my spine hit the cold, rough brick. "Because the board was crowded," she said, pulling a small silver remote from her pocket. "Julian, Elena, the board members, your father, they all thought they were the masters of this city. They thought they were the ones pulling the strings. But they were just playing with toys. I needed someone to dismantle them publicly, someone with a motive, like a scorned bride. You were perfect. Your anger was the catalyst, your public humiliation the distraction." She raised the remote. "Wait," I yelled, reaching out. "What about the flash drive? The one in Geneva? The one they're all killing for?" She paused, a thin, jagged smile playing on her lips. "You really think I'd leave that to chance? You've been carrying it, Sarah, sewn into the hem of that ridiculous dress since the moment you stepped into the dressing room this morning." My hands flew to the heavy, bead-encrusted fabric of my train. I felt the sharp prick of a needle hidden in the lining, and as I ripped it open, a small black drive fell into the mud. I looked down at it, then back at the woman. "It's not a data drive," she whispered, her eyes turning cold and dark. "It's a detonator, and you're the one holding the switch." At that moment, the cars surged forward, their headlights converging on me like a spotlight on a stage. I heard the distinct click-clack of a weapon being readied behind me. I realized then that the woman wasn't there to rescue me. She was there to witness the finale. "Press it," she commanded, her voice dropping to a whisper that cut through the pouring rain. "Or they'll kill you right here in the mud. But if you press it, you become the most wanted woman on the planet. The choice isn't freedom anymore, Sarah. It's survival." I looked at the black drive in my muddy palm. The light on it began to blink, first slowly, then with an accelerating, panicked strobe. The boots were inches away now. I could hear the heavy breathing of the men in gray suits, the sound of their weapons being drawn, the metallic scent of impending violence. "3," the woman counted, her voice echoing off the brick walls. 2. I gripped the device. My thumb hovered over the sensor. I looked at the dark windows of the church, where the guests were still trapped, and then at the woman who was my ghost. I realized, with a horrifying clarity, that she wasn't just using me, she was replacing me. 1, she whispered. I felt a sharp pain in my shoulder, a tranquilizer dart, whistling through the air and burying itself deep into my skin. The world began to tilt, the alleyway spinning like a carousel. My grip on the device loosened. As my knees hit the wet concrete, I saw the woman step forward, her hand reaching down toward the blinking drive. "Thank you, Sarah," she murmured, leaning down until her face was inches from mine. She smelled like my own scent, but wrong, synthetic, chemical, cold. The world will remember the bride who burned it all down, but they won't remember you. She plucked the drive from my numb fingers, and just as my vision flickered to black, I heard a sound that chilled my blood. A low, rhythmic ticking coming from somewhere deep inside the church, far louder than any alarm. She hadn't just planted the drive. She had rigged the entire foundation. The woman stood up, turned her back on me, and began to walk away into the darkness of the alley. I tried to scream, but my throat was frozen, my limbs heavy as lead. And then the ticking stopped. The alley went deathly quiet. I opened my eyes one last time, squinting through the blur, and saw the church doors blow wide open, not from an explosion, but from the inside out. A single figure stepped through the debris, obscured by smoke and flame. It was someone I recognized perfectly, someone who should have been dead for a decade. My sister smiled at me, holding a gun that was aimed directly at the woman who looked just like me. "You missed a spot," my sister said, and pulled the trigger. The gunshot didn't sound like a cinematic bang. It was a sharp, flat crack that vibrated in my teeth. The woman who looked like me, my double, my tormentor, stumbled, her trench coat blooming with a dark, wet flower of crimson at her shoulder. She let out a gasp of pure human shock, the silver remote slipping from her fingers and clattering into the oily gutter water. My sister Maya didn't look at me. She didn't look at her target. Her eyes were fixed on the church with a terrifying, hollow intensity. She was dressed in tactical gear that looked like it had been dragged through a war zone, her face smeared with soot and streaks of dried blood. She looked like a ghost that had finally learned how to kill. "Get up, Sarah," Maya commanded, her voice raspy, lacking the warmth I remembered from our childhood. "The foundation is rigged with thermite. In 60 seconds, this entire block is going to be a crater." I tried to move, but the tranquilizer was a heavy weight, tethering my limbs to the earth. My brain felt like it was wading through molasses. "Maya?" I slurred, the name tasting like a forgotten prayer. You died. The boat." "The boat was the best thing that ever happened to me," she said, stepping over the writhing, wounded double. She reached down, grabbed me by the arm, and hauled me to my feet with a strength that shouldn't have belonged to her. It was the only way to get out from under Father's portfolio. "Move!" She dragged me toward the mouth of the alley. Behind us, the woman in the trench coat was clutching her shoulder, her face a mask of twisted, hysterical rage. She lunged for the silver remote in the gutter, her fingers clawing at the muck. "You think you've won?" the double shrieked, her voice morphing, the pitch rising until it sounded like glass grinding on glass. "The sequence is hardwired into the city grid. You can't stop the collapse." Maya didn't turn back. She jammed a pistol into my hand. It felt impossibly heavy, and shoved me toward a dark SUV idling at the street corner. "Drive, Sarah. Follow the signal on the dash. Don't look at the rear view. Don't look at the fire." "Where are we going?" I gasped, stumbling as the world tilted at a nauseating angle. "To the source," Maya spat, her eyes scanning the rooftops. "To the people who decided your life was a draft for a story they wanted to write. We're going to burn the script, and we're going to start by killing the author." I scrambled into the driver's seat.
My hands were slick with mud and something darker, blood, or perhaps just the grease of the engine. The car roared to life, a high-performance growl that sounded like a wild animal. As I slammed the transmission into gear, I risked one look behind me. The woman who looked like me was gone. In her place, a group of men in gray suits, the ones from the church, were swarming the alley, but they weren't attacking Maya. They were kneeling. They were bowing. "Drive!" Maya screamed, leaning out the window and firing her weapon into the air, the flashes lighting up the rain like strobe lights. I floored it. The tires squealed and the car lurched forward, fishtailing onto the main road. The city was a blur of neon and shadows. I looked at the dashboard. A GPS screen was glowing, not with a map of the city, but with a real-time thermal feed of the building I had just left. A giant red cursor was blinking directly over the church. Suddenly, the phone Maya had tossed into the passenger seat began to ring. It wasn't a standard ringtone. It was a recording of my own voice, sobbing, saying the same 3 words over and over again. "I am sorry. I am sorry. I am sorry." I picked it up, my hand shaking so hard the phone rattled against my ear. "Hello?" A voice spoke on the other end. It was calm, cultivated, and unmistakably my father's. "You've done a magnificent job with the 3rd act, Sarah. The fire, the betrayal, the sister returned from the dead. It's been quite the spectacle for our investors." My heart stopped. "Father?" "Where are you?" "I'm watching, darling," he said, and I could hear the faint melodic sound of a cello playing in the background, muffled as if he were in a soundproof room. "And I'm afraid your sister has been a very naughty girl. She wasn't supposed to intervene. Now, the ending needs to be rewritten. Tell me, do you have any idea why the brakes on that SUV were serviced by my men this morning?" I slammed my foot onto the pedal, but the car didn't slow. It accelerated. I pumped the brake, but it went straight to the floor, soft and empty, offering no resistance. "Sarah," Maya yelled, reaching for the wheel, her face draining of color. "What's wrong?" "The brakes," I choked out, the car hitting 80, then 90, as the road ahead dipped sharply toward the harbor. "He cut the lines." The phone in my hand went silent, and then a new sound began to play. A timer, counting down with a digital, rhythmic chime that filled the cabin. 10, 9, 8. Maya looked at me, her eyes wide, and she didn't reach for the door handle. She reached into her vest and pulled out a jagged, blackened key. The key to the vault I had been told was empty. "He thinks this is his story," she whispered, her voice cold with a terrifying resolve. "But he forgot one thing, Sarah. He's the one who taught us how to lie." She didn't try to stop the car. She braced herself against the dashboard and grabbed the steering wheel, jerking it hard toward the concrete barrier of the pier. "We don't stop," she screamed, her eyes blazing. "We go through." As the car smashed through the guardrail and launched into the black, churning water of the harbor, the GPS feed on the dashboard flickered, changed, and displayed a single live camera view. My father, sitting in his study, looking directly into the lens, holding a detonator of his own. He smiled, and behind him, the entire city skyline began to blink in a synchronized, lethal pattern. The car hit the water with a sound like a bomb, and as the cabin began to fill with freezing, dark ink, I realized the timer on the phone hadn't stopped at 0. It had reset to 99 minutes. And then, the phone began to record. The impact wasn't a death. It was an awakening. The freezing salt water rushed into the cabin, a violent, suffocating shroud that should have been the end. But Maya was already moving, her movements precise and unnatural. She smashed the tempered glass of the passenger window with the butt of her pistol and hauled me out into the black abyss of the harbor. We surfaced 100 yards out,
gasping for air amidst the oily scum and churning debris. Above us, the city was dying. The synchronized flickering of the lights wasn't a glitch. It was a cascade failure of the power grid, sector by sector, plunging the metropolis into a prehistoric darkness. The church behind us didn't just burn, it imploded, a controlled demolition that leveled the city block and buried the secrets of the Ponzi scheme under tons of pulverized stone. "He's destroying the evidence," Maya hissed, treading water as she pulled me toward a hidden, floating platform camouflaged by the harbor's refuse. "He's wiping the board clean. Everyone who was at that wedding, everyone who knew his name, they're all being erased." "Why us?" I coughed, my lungs burning. "Why not just kill us?" "Because he needs an antagonist for his final act," she said, climbing onto the platform and dragging me up with her. "He needs a scapegoat to blame for the city's collapse. He's framing us, Sarah. He's going to tell the world that the 2 daughters he lost were actually domestic terrorists who destroyed the financial district." I reached into the pocket of my ruined gown, the pocket where I had stuffed the burner phone before we hit the water. It was waterproof, a high-end piece of hardware. It was still recording. I looked at the screen. The timer had reached 60 minutes. "We aren't the scapegoats," I said, my voice steadying. My fear was gone, replaced by the same cold, tactical intelligence I had inherited from the man who raised me. We're the audience that decided to walk onto the stage. We reached the shore, shivering and wretched, but we didn't run. We walked toward my father's estate, a cliffside fortress that looked down upon the burning city like a king watching his peasants fight. The gates were wide open. He was waiting. He sat in his study, the room illuminated only by the flames rising from the harbor. He was sipping a glass of vintage scotch, his tuxedo pristine, his expression one of bored anticipation. He didn't even look up when we entered, the mud from our boots staining his hand-woven Persian rug. "You're late," he said, his voice smooth as silk.
"The finale was supposed to happen 20 minutes ago." "The script changed," I said, stepping into the center of the room. I held up the burner phone. "I didn't just record the countdown, Father. I broadcasted it. Every server, every news outlet, every government agency currently tracking this power outage is receiving a packet of data. It's not just the fraud. It's the offshore accounts, the political payoffs, the names of the judges you have on payroll. It's all in the cloud, and it's irreversible." He finally looked up, his eyes narrowing. For the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine irritation. Not fear, but the frustration of a man whose masterpiece had been edited by a hack. "You think you've won?" he chuckled, standing up and setting his glass down. "You've destroyed my empire. But you've also destroyed your own futures. You'll be hunted. You'll be shadows." "We were shadows the moment you made us," Maya replied, stepping forward and leveling her pistol at his chest. "Wait," he said, holding up a hand. He clicked a button on his desk. Suddenly, the walls of the study shifted, revealing hidden screens showing the streets below. Dozens of police cruisers and tactical vehicles were converging on the estate. "I didn't call the police to protect me, Sarah. I called them to witness your surrender. You're holding a gun in a room full of hidden cameras. The story the world will see tomorrow isn't a redemption arc. It's the tragedy of 2 sisters who went mad with power." He stepped toward us, his smile thin and triumphant. "History is written by the survivors, and I am the one with the ink." I looked at Maya. She looked at me. We knew exactly what had to be done. We hadn't come here to kill him. We had come here to give him exactly what he wanted: the spotlight. "You're right," I said, dropping the gun. I walked over to the desk, picked up the remote for the estate's broadcast system, and pressed live. History is written by those who survive. But the audience doesn't care about the writer anymore. They care about the performance. I turned the camera toward the window, showing the entire city the inferno, and then turned it back to my father. I didn't say a word.
I just started laughing. It wasn't the laugh of a victim. It was the laugh of a woman who had finally realized the punchline. Maya joined in, a hollow, haunting sound that filled the room. The police burst through the doors, but they didn't see a criminal mastermind. They saw two terrified women, a gun on the floor, and a man, my father, standing in the middle of a room filled with incriminating evidence that was already being plastered across every screen in the country. He looked at the officers, then at the camera, and realized the trap. He had built his world on the assumption that he was the only one allowed to pull the strings. He hadn't realized that once you teach someone how to weave a lie, they can eventually use those threads to hang you. They handcuffed him. As they dragged him away, he looked back at me, his face a mask of fury. I didn't look away. I simply watched, the silence of the room finally comfortable. Maya looked at me, her hand gripping mine. What now? I looked at the charred ruins of the city through the glass, then at the empty study. The wedding was over, the reputation was destroyed, and the villain was in chains. I picked up his glass of scotch, took a sip, and smiled. Now, I said, we stop being characters. It's time to start writing our own story. We walked out of the estate and into the cooling ash of the morning, leaving the wreckage of our past behind. We were finally free. But as we reached the gates, my phone chimed. A new message from an unknown number. Act 4 begins tomorrow. I didn't answer. I just kept walking. The story wasn't over. It had only just shed its skin. Image prompts. 1. Cinematic close-up of a bride standing in a ruined, smoke-filled church. Ivory lace dress torn and splattered with mud. Her expression cold and calculating as she holds a glowing smartphone. Shards of shattered stained glass in the background. Hyper-realistic, dramatic lighting. 8K resolution. 2. A wide-angle cinematic shot of a bride standing alone in the center of a church aisle, while guests in the background panic and flee. She is holding a burner phone. Atmosphere of chaos and betrayal. High contrast. Moody color palette with deep plum and white tones. Cinematic film grain. 3. A dramatic, cinematic portrait of a woman in a tattered, rain-soaked wedding dress, standing in a dark alley at night. A black sedan with headlights beaming toward her. Multiple men in gray tactical suits emerging from shadows. Rain falling. Intense suspenseful atmosphere. Photorealistic. 4.
A cinematic split composition shot. On one side, a bride standing in a ruined church. On the other side, her mirror image in a black trench coat holding a mysterious device. Moody lighting, dark industrial aesthetic, high-tension atmosphere, professional color grading.